Well, thank you, Stephen Ratner, so much for joining us this morning. You are the ex-Car Czar. It's funny, it was fascinating reading Overhaul over the weekend as you give us the inside details of what happened as you were saving Chrysler and General Motors. One of the most interesting things is you're not fond of the title Car Czar. Why not?
Because I wasn't a czar. I was part of the reporting chain that existed within Treasury and the White House. I reported to Tim Geithner and Larry Summers and indirectly to the president. I wasn't the czar of anything. I didn't have my own authority over anything. And most importantly, I had a team of 14 people, including myself, that we call Team Auto, that really deserve an enormous amount of the credit here. And so that's why.
And it was a very varied team. You said you started as strangers and you left as friends. I found it very interesting, sir. You talked about touring the Dodge Ram plant where they build trucks, and you said that was the first time you really realized how many lives were depending on you. How so?
Because when you're sitting in Washington or New York running numbers and spreadsheets and looking at head counts and this and that, it is hard to understand the human side of it, the personal side of this for the people. But what I really did make an impression on me was that day when we went through the Dodge Ram plant, and I was watching the assembly line work, which is a fascinating thing for almost anybody probably. But then I started looking at these workers, and I realized that these workers at that moment in time when we were in Detroit in early March, these workers were all in jeopardy of losing their jobs. And I knew that for many of them, there would never be another job. And so you suddenly had a human face or a human dimension to go with lots of dry statistics and policy papers and so on and so forth.
You were scathing about Rick Wagoner, and you come back to that several times in the book, even close to the end, talking about why you made the decision to let him go. Why, sir?
Because our view was that anyone who had taken a company and in effect let it go off a cliff to the point where it needed a massive infusion of government money probably shouldn't be in his job. But what really made the decision even easier, or compounded the problem, if you will, was on February 17th when GM submitted its so-called viability plan to show us in the world how they were going to make the company work. It was not a plan, it was a hope. It was something that depended on a significant rebound in car sales and on a lot of things happening that nobody could count on. And it just, to us, showed a grasp of a lack of reality on how dire the situation was. And it just seemed inconceivable to allow someone who put that forward as his plan for what to do with the company to try to lead the company out of this mess.
Well, and you talk about how management really does matter in the book, Overhaul. But yet when you were replacing Fritz Henderson, you weren't really sure who you were going to put in the position. Was that prudent at that time?
You mean when we were replacing Rick Wagoner?
No, when you were replacing Fritz and you were having Ed Whitacre step up. It sounds like Ed wasn't that thrilled about taking the role.
Well, I was not in Washington at that point, and we had turned the company back over to the board. And so it was really the board's decision on what to do about Fritz and who to put in that role. I think that Ed was the right decision at that time. I think he was enthusiastic about it, and I think he did an enormous amount of good in terms of changing the company, even though he was only there for a short time. He really did break apart this old GM insular culture and make it a much more responsive, vibrant organization, even in the short time he was there.
I don't think anyone realizes just how close those companies came to going under. And you talk about the race to the courthouse to save Chrysler. How close were you to letting Chrysler go?
Well, with Chrysler, we were very close to letting it go. It was a very tough decision. It was the toughest decision the president had to make in the course of this whole episode, because Chrysler was a marginal player. It had been hollowed out by its years of Daimler and private equity ownership. It had not one car that was on the Consumer Reports bestseller list, most recommended list. And so it was very marginal. And in addition, if Chrysler had gone, it would have strengthened GM and Ford, who would have picked up the preponderance of its sales. So that was the most difficult decision that the president had to make. As I said, it was debated very hotly and professionally within the White House, and ultimately the president made a decision to save it. but only if we could get shared sacrifice from all of the key stakeholders. And that race took us right up to the deadline of April 30th, because until that moment, we weren't sure whether everybody would come on board. And so until the last minute, it wasn't clear whether Chrysler was going to be saved or whether Chrysler would be allowed to liquidate.
Sounds like Sergio Marchionne is quite the negotiator.
Sergio is one of the most impressive executives I've dealt with. He is an intense workaholic. He is got a strong personality, which is good, real strong leadership skills, and he's a decider. He's very decisive and knows what he wants to do. And the dynamic with Sergio after March 30th, when the president made his speech and basically said the only way forward for Chrysler is in an alliance with Fiat, it had the unfortunate but inevitable, unavoidable consequence of giving Sergio a bit more negotiating leverage, or at least in his own mind, than what he would have had we not gone that direction, gone that way. And so it was a tough negotiation. He's a tough negotiator, but I think that the alliance that emerged between Fiat and Chrysler was really a win-win for both companies.
You talk a lot about Rahm Emanuel and even quote him as using an expletive, talking about the UAW and raising the question of why even save GM. Are you concerned any of your quotes are going to hurt his run for Chicago mayor?
I don't want to hurt his run for Chicago mayor, and I think people have to look at those quotes in the context in which they were made. The comment about the UAW was meant not because he's not a supporter of the UAW or doesn't believe in the UAW, but he wanted to emphasize the president's commitment to shared sacrifice on the part of all of these stakeholders. And one of the most impressive things to me about my service in this administration was the willingness of the president and Rahm Emanuel to do the right thing, to question preconceived notions, to say that there would be no sacred cows, that everybody was going to have to sacrifice. And I think that this should be viewed as an incredible positive statement about Rahm Emanuel, because he is going to face the same tough choices in Chicago, and people should know they're getting someone who's not afraid of these tough choices.
But politics did play a role in some of this. I know you were obviously involved in saving the car companies, but when the question came up about moving General Motors perhaps to the Warren Tech Center, apparently the president stepped in and said they can't do that to Detroit. Is that true?
I don't know that the president himself stepped in. We did consult with the White House, and look, this restructuring took place almost exactly as if it were in the private sector, and there were really no material political considerations. I would acknowledge that with respect to GM moving its headquarters out of Detroit, there was a strong feeling in the White House that doing that to Detroit at that moment, when it had 25% unemployment and could have literally faced bankruptcy, was not a desirable goal, and that the cost to GM of keeping its headquarters in the Renaissance Center was sufficiently small that was a prudent decision to make and a prudent place for the government to weigh in. But I would emphasize, I use that in the book because I think it is the only place that the government ever really weighed in. I think with respect to 99% of the decisions, the companies made them based on their own commercial interests, with the full support of the president and everybody below him.
And with the new management in place, Mr. Ratner, do you think the two car companies, Chrysler and GM, will now survive ultimately?
I'm quite optimistic. I think both companies are ahead of plan. I think GM, it is easier to see a very clear path to continued viability. The company is doing very, very well. The sales have been good. They're holding on to market share for the 4 core brands that they're keeping. They've had 2 quarters of positive net income, something they've not accomplished in several years. I think Dan Akerson will be a very good CEO. So I think they have everything going for it. We knew, as I alluded to in the case of Chrysler, that that was a tougher challenge because of the product as much as anything, because of not having any cars on the Consumer Reports recommended list. So it's harder today to say with certainty that Chrysler is out of the hospital, out of the emergency room, but it's doing well. It's, as I said, ahead of plan financially. It's having good car sales, but we'll really know about Chrysler as they start to roll out the new models. The Jeep Grand Cherokee has just come out. The Fiat 500 will be coming out in the fall, and then a series of what Sergio calls refreshes to the Chrysler line, where he's spending some money to really try to bring the product up to standard. And so I would say 6 months, 9 months from now, we'll have a much clearer picture on Chrysler, but I am optimistic.
And what about the future for you, sir? I know you do have some legal entanglements that you have to get sorted out, but where will we see you again?
I honestly don't know the answer to that question. I loved my car experience. I really enjoyed writing about it. I felt this was a story that was a great success for the Obama administration that people should really have a chance to read about and understand, because, as you know, bailouts remain unpopular, amazingly enough to me, given their success. And so I'm now in the process of finishing up promoting that book, and then I'll step back and think about it. I expect that I would stay involved in Wall Street to some degree, and also try to stay involved in these issues like the car industry and like the economy that I care about, and hopefully have something to contribute now.
Well, thank you so much, Stephen Ratner, the author of Overhaul, for joining us and giving us that inside look into how you save Chrysler and General Motors. Thanks so much.
Thank you.